Relationships don't usually fall apart overnight. It's the small miscommunications, the unmet needs, the disconnection that builds over time. And for many couples, by the time they realize that something's wrong, it feels almost impossible to fix. Today, we are talking about what's actually happening beneath the surface and what it takes to repair a relationship once trust has been broken. Joining me today is Kayla Crane, owner of South Denver Therapy, where she specializes in relationships, relational trauma, and helping individuals and couples navigate some of the most difficult moments in their relationships, including infidelity. Kayla, I'm really looking forward to our conversation today.
Hi, thanks for having me. Me too.
Behind the practice.
Well, let's start with you. What led you to focus specifically on relationships and relational trauma?
So, when I first became a therapist, I thought I would do individuals and trauma work, individual trauma. So I was kind of taking that path, like getting EMDR trained and stuff like that. And then during like COVID and stuff, I was having a hard time in my marriage, which I think a lot of people can, relate to. And so I was using all like my therapist resources to learn to read books and stuff like about relationships. And I came across one that I had never heard of, and it really resonated with me, unlike everything else I had been taught in terms of like couples therapy. And so it really connected with me. And so I started kind of doing a little bit more work with that, working with somebody who really specialized in that model. And then I realized I could blend the two and use that training that I have as a trauma therapist because I noticed there was kind of a gap there with a lot of the couples work. A lot of the training, they're always like, you got to refer out for individual trauma work. You always got to refer out. But I saw so much value in doing it in a couple, because a lot of the trauma that obviously the relational trauma that's impacting the relationship. And so it felt like there was just this kind of hole there where it was like, okay, we could do couples therapy or you could do your each individual trauma
Yeah.
work. So I thought it was really nice to like kind of bring it all together. And I've seen a lot of success with that, especially with things like infidelity and stuff.
Yeah. And for people that are listening, they maybe are not familiar with the term relational trauma. Will
Right.
you explain what that really means?
Yeah, so I use it to refer to trauma inside the relationship or maybe outside of the relationship, but it's significantly impacting this relationship. So inside the relationship, like the most obvious one would be infidelity, but also, it's not uncommon if there's been a history of like substance abuse or
Mm.
something to have some kind of like, really bad fights or cruel things and stuff like that. That would be trauma. But then also, maybe somebody had a traumatic relationship, a past relationship, and that's impacting how they're operating in their relationship today. And so, maybe somebody was cheated on in not in their current relationship, but they were in the past. That's probably going to impact how they're operating in their current relationship, even if there aren't any trust issues.
Mm.
And so that would also be some form of relational trauma, is how I look at it.
And relational trauma is different from just having relationship issues.
Yeah, because that when you have the trauma is it dysregulates your nervous system. And so that makes it difficult to behave the way that ideally you would behave, right?
Mm.
Or, if you could take a breath and, hey, this is what I want to do. But when you are operating out of a place from trauma, those, you don't really have the option, because your nervous system kind of takes over and it goes into survival mode.
Mm.
So it's really hard to even utilize the tools that you have if that is there because that is just takes over everything.
So if someone's listening right now and they're thinking, maybe that's me. I thought maybe it was just me and my significant other having relationship issues. What are some of the signs that someone might be dealing with relational trauma and they don't even
Mhm.
realize it?
Yeah. So, if you step back in the moment, it might be difficult to recognize, but if you can step back and reflect on um, some conflicts or some reactions that you might have had, if the reaction seemed maybe a little disproportionate to you, right? To somebody else, it might, but to you, if you have a response and you're going, wait a second, that doesn't seem to like make sense from for the situation. That's probably a sign that like your nervous system is kind of running the show and you might be operating out of some kind of just a protective mode, like a trauma response versus acting how you would, like I said, like you would ideally act, or maybe, you would just need some tools and hey, we could fix that. But if you're responding in a way where you're going, I don't know what comes over, like that's something people say a lot. Like, I don't know what comes over me when I do that. That's a clue to me that it could be some kind of trauma in there.
So when you're working with clients, what are some of the most common patterns that you see that lead to this disconnection?
In terms of like what does the conflict look like that will get them there?
Yeah, yeah. I think that a lot of people, like you said, there's sometimes they say a certain thing like, I don't even know what comes over me. Like when you're working with them, is there a certain pattern that you see that tends to happen time and time again?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to like trust issues, right? If there's been infidelity in the relationship, usually what that's going to look like is some kind of, I mean, there are some things it totally makes sense, right? Like if your partner's cheated on you and their phone rings at 3 in the morning, anyone is going to have a negative response to that. That's very expected. But then if you're driving down the street and then you don't realize what's going on, but you're getting this like a emotional response, that's a sign of a trauma response. And that's having like a physical reaction is when you know that it's been like a trauma versus like the thought like, wow, I hate that that happened. You're actually having some kind of physical response, maybe a little like panicky or short of breath or scared or something other than just what you would expect to see.
And I think that for when you were explaining all that, there was certain things that came up just with me and my relationship where I'm like, okay, well, I noticed that this doesn't happen. I can't imagine if, the phone rang at 3 in the middle of the night, that it would trigger this sort of response. And I think that a lot of times we might not even realize that it is associated with trauma. What are some common things that you see that happen with those situations?
Trauma always needs to be processed in an experiential way. And so
Yeah.
even just talk therapy wouldn't process that trauma. And so if you're seeing that and either you're experiencing that or your partner is like, hey, why don't you just chill out? Just chill. Like that's not going to work. And so that needs to be addressed. It's not just like a dramatic thing looking for attention usually. It's actually a response that needs to be treated again as trauma versus just like a problematic behavior, which is a lot of times people that's how they do it. And so that's kind of like I mean, it can be shaming, of course, but also it's very unrealistic to say just like, hey, don't, have a panic attack when my,
Because it's that
like
easy.
right, exactly. And so I think that shows up a lot when people kind of just try to rationalize through it. It just doesn't work that way.
What happens when two people with very different attachment styles end up getting married or being in a relationship?
Mhm. Yeah, that's actually the most common is usually, I mean, besides secure and secure, the most common insecure pairing is anxious and avoidant, which are opposite, but also complementary. I try to reframe it in that way because they can actually like complement each other pretty nicely. That it's much more difficult to work with two people that have an avoidant attachment or two people that have an anxious attachment because there's no one to balance it out. And so, like I said, if they have the tools, they can work together nicely. Otherwise, they can kind of go against each other. But, so somebody with like an avoidant attachment, there's also sometimes the language would be like a distancer, and anxious would be pursuer. And so you have the balance. Somebody's pursuing and somebody's distancing. And so it's like this. Again, if you can work it the right way, they can complement each other well, but you just need to be able to have those tools and self-awareness and be able to recognize like what's happening here. And usually, again, it's so hard when you're dysregulated to use any tools. That is incredibly difficult, almost impossible. And so, like, one of the best things that just an anxious and avoidant partner can implement is just the idea of a timeout. And so you just take a timeout when things are getting out of control, not productive. I say usually like 2 hours is a good rule of thumb, not 5 minutes. You need some time to get regulated. And then you can come back and use the tools that you learned, whatever that is, the communication tools or whatever. But you've got to be able to put some like distance between that pursuer distance or cycle. So you've got to be
Yeah.
able to break the cycle a little bit.
Well, and you mentioned infidelity specifically, and I think that infidelity is something that can feel impossible to come back from. From your experience, what's actually happening beneath the surface when that occurs?
When they have a hard time coming back from it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if people say, I just don't believe you ever again, I'm never going to trust you again. And sometimes that's just what it is. They just have kind of said, this is something I can't recover from.
Mhm.
More often though, so when we usually do the trauma work with infidelity, that's at the end of the entire process. We can't start there because the trauma is still occurring, right? Like, and so
Mhm.
we do the whole model, we process, we talk through the infidelity, come to a place, and if they decide we want to look forward, we want to repair our relationship. Sometimes when people say, okay, we want to repair our relationship, but I just can't stop thinking about that text message I saw between you and her. I can't, every time I drive by that restaurant that you went to with him, I can't, whatever. That's
Yeah.
where the trauma work would like kind of clean that up nicely, usually. But it's when somebody is already ready to move forward. I want to be able to trust my partner. And doing that's not going to say, okay, 100% you magically trust your partner now, but it gives your body, it gives your like nervous system the opportunity to even begin to rebuild the trust. But sometimes without that, people can be all in. I want to move forward. I want to let my partner rebuild their trust, but your body's still protecting itself,
Mhm.
and it's like this person doesn't feel safe enough to do it. So it can be really this challenging thing if you don't do that trauma work along with it.
And it sounds like there's a set process for people
Mhm.
who want to repair infidelity. What does that process
Right.
actually look like?
So the model I use is called systematic affair recovery therapy. We first start out with each partner, and all of it's done in a couple sessions. But we go through each of their upbringings, their families of origin, just their childhood, all of that. Then we go through both of their relational histories, previous relationships. With those two pieces, I'm trying to determine beliefs. Childhood is where we become who we are, and we develop beliefs about ourselves, about our self worth. And so I'm trying to figure those out going through that. I'm trying to figure out what was modeled to them growing up, what messages they received about infidelity, all these things that would impact your behavior. Then with the previous relationships, I'm usually looking at the general nature of the relationship, how it began and how it ended, and if there was any infidelity involved. Again, those are continuing to either reinforce and sometimes create new beliefs that you hold about yourselves. And so it's really important because our next step is going through your entire relationship history,
Yeah.
like that relationship. And then once we get done with that, then we tell the whole story of the infidelity. So we don't even get to that story until that point in it. And all of that back history is really like setting the groundwork to really be able to, as we're going through the story of the infidelity, like we can plug this piece of information in here. Now that makes sense why that was difficult. Now that makes sense where things weren't working. Now, it's not to give anyone a pass or anything. It's just to get to that understanding of what happened here. How did we get here? Once we've gotten that whole story and the hurt partner believes they know all that they can know, we've got to put it all together. What actually happened here? There was something going on, obviously, and infidelity was the worst way to handle it, but that's where we are, right? And so we've got to kind of put that together. After that, we acknowledge the impact that it's had on both partners. We acknowledge the impact it's had on the hurt partner, um, because it doesn't just impact like that relationship. It impacts how that partner sees themselves, how they operate in the relationship as a parent, in the world, as a colleague, or it informs how they treat themselves, like it operates everywhere, every part of their life. So I'll help the involved partner acknowledge all of that. And that's really a demonstration of empathy and accountability and validation. We also will acknowledge the impact it's had on the involved partner, but that serves a different purpose. That's also more of just the accountability piece. Like, I want you to see that I haven't, been acting this way because of as result of the infidelity. You need to see that it has hurt them. What they've done is hurt them to have any confidence that it won't happen again. After that, they choose a path. Do they want to stay together or not? If they do choose to stay together, then let's look forward. How do we continue rebuilding trust? How do you continue making up for what you've done? And then just how do we prevent this from ever happening again?
Yeah. What are some of the mistakes that couples make when they're trying to move forward after infidelity or betrayal?
Like if they don't come do infidelity work,
Yeah.
sweeping it under the rug. That's like or just talking about it. The thing is, by the time I've met with people, even if it was a recent discovery, they've asked a lot of questions. And while it's important to have all the understanding of all the some people are so desperate to just understand why that they'll just ask any question, and some like detail oriented questions, those can actually do more harm than good, and those will
Mm.
create sometimes trauma, like very specific content like that
Yeah.
stuff. And fortunately we can use some trauma therapy to clear that up. But I mean, I think it's always important to I tell people you're going to have a million questions. Just make a note in your phone and let's go over them together. And when we go over them, when they ask them, if it seems like it might not be a great question from my perspective, I'll just ask them, like, what would be the value in knowing this answer? Will it contribute to the understanding of the infidelity? And if the answer is yes, then it's an important question. But a lot of times they'll think it through and be like, no, I guess not. I'm just trying to understand what's happening here. So I think going about it, either ignoring it completely and pretending like it didn't happen, is not that it'll come up, whether it's a year
Yeah.
later, 10 years later, 20 years later, or just kind of asking every possible question, just that like desperation, which I can empathize with. But a lot of times it really does more harm than good.
Is it truly possible for a relationship to be stronger after something like that?
Yeah, actually it is, because there's so many things that were not working, whether it was something individual but impacting the relationship, or whether it was just something relational, which is often the case, the dynamics not working. And again, infidelity is the worst way to go about it. But regardless, it came to light now and we've got to address it. And so it gives us the ability to not just like rebuild, but like now build their dream relationship. And so
Mm.
we're not trying to get back to where they were before the infidelity. Things weren't good right then. And like I said, it's not necessarily a relational thing, but something wasn't working. So we want to get things better than before
Yeah.
to prevent it in the future.
So if someone reaches out to you, what are they typically feeling in that moment?
With infidelity, they're usually feeling like fear, so much fear, shame, uncertainty, or anxiety for the future. Obviously, there's anger. Anger, a lot of times, is more, they don't often, like, a lot of what I see is the vulnerable stuff. The anger is usually like projected to the partner, which makes sense that anger is covering up something more vulnerable. And
Mm.
so that's usually with me like a neutral, safe person where they can demonstrate that vulnerability. If somebody's just cheated on you, the last thing you feel safe doing is crying and telling them how scared you are. That just feels more vulnerable after they've hurt you. So, yeah, I mean, all the scary future things, but also that self shame, guilt, I should have known. There's something wrong with me. What does this mean for the future? Who's going to get the kids? Are we ever going to get past this? Am I going to think about this every single time I drive down that one street in our town? Just
Mhm.
like all the negative feelings are usually wrapped up in there.
What shifts do you see in clients once they start understanding these patterns within themselves and their relationship?
I think I see hope sometimes, like, okay, this is something that we can actually work through. This is actually something we're identifying as a problem before it might not have even been identified. So putting like language to it, especially if we're talking about like any kind of attachment style stuff, people usually feel some like relief or maybe validation with that, because it's like, "But it's not just me. Like everyone with an anxious attachment behaves this way." And the
Yeah.
good news is that means there's a lot of tools to work on it.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of like, hopefully, the hope, some grief, definitely. Why were we so separate? Like, why didn't we do this sooner? Why didn't we work on things before it got to this place? That shows up a lot. I think those are the big ones.
How does it change the way that they communicate going forward? Do you see them really, now that they know this about themselves, everything's really shifted in their communication?
Yeah, I mean, it's not like a light switch. But I tell them like we can't like the goal isn't to create a perfect circumstance where there's never any temptation or never a fight again or anything. That's just unrealistic. It's not going to happen. But the goal is to develop these tools so you can communicate the next time you're not feeling like you're good enough for your partner or the next time your partner, really hurt you. Like having these tools and they take practice just like learning any new skill. But I think sometimes people, when they first kind of go into it, they're like, okay, looking forward, we've got to talk about what happens if this one thing happens or this or this. And I'm like, we can't anticipate any possible, difficult scenario. That's just, it's
Mhm.
not going to work. But what we can do is we can build these tools and get really good at them and practice. And when you mess up, it doesn't like you can still learn from that, right? Reflect back, hey, here's what I will do next time. This is what I wish I would have done, that kind of stuff. But yeah, like just looking at it as a whole new way of operating in a place where we can handle stuff. We can talk about hard stuff. We're going to fight again. We're going to go through really hard times again. And now we have tools to communicate through it rather than some other horrible choice.
If someone's listening right now and they're really resonating with everything that we've been saying here and they feel that maybe their relationship is beyond repair, what would you want them to know?
That actually many, a lot of people, relationships are far more often able to be repaired than not. It's not uncommon that people will I'll talk to someone, they're like, "Yeah, I don't think, my partner just wants me to come. I'm pretty much out. I'll give it a shot for one session," or something like that. And I'll say, "Okay, tell me what's going on." And I'll be like, "Oh my gosh, we can totally fix this. This is, like there's so much that can be fixed and that can be repaired. And a lot of people don't recognize that. And I've heard people so many times saying, like, wow, if I would have done this in my previous relationship, actually, that might have worked out. So I think having a little bit more like hope or faith that actually, let's see if there are options. The options aren't just like like I act okay with it or it's not okay. No, a lot of things can really be fixed. And if it's a good relationship, if there's a foundation, so much can be fixed.
Kayla, this has been such a great conversation. I feel like we just touched the surface. If someone wants to learn more about you or your work or connect with you, what's the best place for them to go to?
Yeah, my website is just southdenvertherapy.com. And I'm also on Facebook and Instagram, South Denver Therapy.
Well, if this conversation resonated with you, take a moment to reflect on how you're showing up in your relationships because small shifts in awareness can lead to powerful changes in connection. Thank you again, Kayla, for joining me. And thank you to everyone for tuning into this week's episode of Behind the Practice. We will see you next time.
Thanks, Katie. Nice talking to you.
Behind the Practice is produced by Next Step Social and Podcasting and hosted by Katie Brinkley and Sean Quintero. A special thank you to our guest today and everyone who made this episode possible. For more information or to be on the show, visit nextstepsocial.com.